You are listening to Talking Africa, the podcast that gets behind the news from the continent. My name's Nick Norbrook. Welcome to the pod. We'll be talking this week about the economic impacts of the coronavirus and how it may contribute to a perfect storm for the continent. Today, my guest is the Nairobi-based investment analyst, Aly-Khan Satchu, the founder and CEO of Rich Management. You can say hi on Twitter at Aly-Khan Satchu. That's at ALY-KHAN-SATCHU. Now, Africa is facing a triple whammy, especially if you're sitting in East Africa. Not only do you have locusts who arrived recently and are devastating livelihoods for farmers, not only do you have coronavirus dragging down key economic sectors like tourism, but you also have a real debt headache, and many countries have maxed out their balance sheets. Aly-Khan Satchu wrote an opinion column for the Africa Report website on exactly this subject, which I recommend you check out. He takes up the story.
Obviously, China was the main financier of the biggest infrastructure ever undertaken in Kenya's history since independence. Therefore, Kenya has been a taker of financing from China, and therefore is atypical because most African countries are also suppliers of primary commodities into China. And I think, what is also clear to me now is that China will be looking to scale back. I remember at the FOCAC 2018 summit in Beijing, Xi Jinping spoke about the end of vanity. He spoke about looking more aggressively at some of these enormous projects that China had financed. So the signal was there that, money was not going to be so easy. As you probably know, the railway has not gone to its desired destination, which was as far as the DR Congo. So I think there's definitely a challenge around making sure the railway, does what it was meant to do on the ticket and connect those hinterland countries, because otherwise this is compounding a problem of a huge expenditure with no foreseeable return on investment in the foreseeable future, if it's just stopping where it's currently stopping, which is a small village out just near Naivasha. But what's interesting, I suppose, is how the geopolitical chips are going to fall. President Kenyatta was in Washington recently. He's the first mover in seeking to negotiate a free trade agreement with the Americans. The IMF were here last week. So I think it's a very interesting moment for Kenya. And I suspect because of the current circumstances, we're going to see a pivot in the direction of the United States. And I think that's already happening. So I think that's one way Kenya is going to play its cards at this moment in time. And it will be interesting to watch how that plays out. But obviously, the SGR is symptomatic of what is, I think, a problem across the continent, in that huge investments have been made where the return on investment is not, nowhere near coming into play, and that implies a pretty vicious credit crunch. And I think Kenya is similar to many other countries in that respect. With the first part of your question, which was about the locusts, this is a sort of biblical type situation. It's been they hatched in the Yemen and in the Empty Quarter because of this unique weather system that we've been encountering of late. And when you look at the situation, and the reports from the FAO were hopelessly short-handed and short-changed in dealing with the problem. It's about 100 kilometers away from us in Nairobi. And all expectations are it goes 500x because of the rains that have now arrived. So that's another very, very big concern. And then, you've got this economic situation. Kenya's not in the direct firing line like Angola or Nigeria, who are big suppliers of their commodities into China. We're just selling some avocados, and in that sense, we're fortunate that we're not that dependent. But we're already, we will see a blowback because the global economy is weakening so fast, and as I said, the Chinese will not be in a position to play Santa Claus like they've been playing for a while.
Nor, too, I imagine, will the US, even if, and you're absolutely right, the pivot probably is back to Washington for Kenya, but, the election season being what it is, it might be difficult to do anything more than cosmetics. You've mentioned in your piece about the gorging on borrowing and balance sheets being maxed out for most African countries. Are you worried then that for those countries who rely on a floor on commodity prices to help them make payments, some of them may be putting their repayments at risk?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure plenty of those countries already in a very desperate situation. I mean, you take a country like Angola, which has pledged, practically 80% of its production as loan repayments. They've got to recalculate. I mean, I think this was already below the prices that they were planning for in their budgets. And now you've got an even bigger price drop coming. So without doubt, we're on the cusp of a major restructuring exercise across the continent. And that's why I've been quite surprised at the relative, the quite sanguine attitude of the likes of the African Development Bank, who keep saying there isn't a debt problem. There's a very big debt problem, and it's gotten a lot worse since the beginning of the year. And there are a number of countries, okay, not at the extreme of the continuum. You have a triple C country like Zambia, which is, basically defaulted. But you have a lot of countries which are directionally moving in Zambia's direction. And I think that's what we have to all be quite concerned about. And with most of the Western world at this point, the bandwidth is being used up with this black swan event, the virus. I think it's going to be a very tricky situation to maintain concentration and deal with these situations in time before they start blowing up.
What would blowing up look like? Because it does seem that the markets had already been aware of the debt problem in various African countries. No one really blinks anymore when there's a downgrade in South Africa, for example. Do you think this will be a step change in difference?
Oh, that's a really interesting point you're making. So, obviously the market has dealt with somewhere like Zambia, where you saw a significant deterioration in the price, which effectively is pricing in a default. But the Eurobond market has been a market that's kept on giving. As I said in the article, there are more than $100 billion of sub-Saharan African issuance in total. And in my experience, you've had a rising tide, you've had a hunger for yield. I think in the Eurobond market, at one point, I remember most African countries were clustered. I think it was last year, within 50 basis points of each other. There was absolutely no granularity in evaluating sub-Saharan African credits. It was as if it was just a pool of cheap money and it needed to find a home, and anything that had a yield above a certain threshold, people would buy. So I think we've got a rude awakening coming in the Eurobond market. I think you got a lot of people in London and New York who've just looked at the number, the interest rate. They haven't really understood that Africa is a number of countries, different credit profiles. And I think we're going to get a Lebanese level shock event that's suddenly going to wake up the entire market. And then we're going to have significant differentials in pricing. And I think that moment is going to come upon us at some point this year.
What would that mean for a country like Kenya?
I think, for Kenya right now, we are at a point when the country can come away from the precipice. I think, we've gone from a time when we had 40% of GDP. We're now well over 60. We don't want to be going much, much higher than here. And I think, fortunately in Kenya, we've got bandwidth within the administration, within the institutions, unlike some other sub-Saharan African countries. And I think, by strong relationships with the IMF and World Bank should allow us to be able to trim our cloth and resize the borrowing now to suit these times. I would thought, we should come out on the other side. It's not going to be easy. The economy will take a big hit, but it's survivable. Whereas the other countries, which I think, it's blinking amber, and it's much, much more difficult to pull back from the brink.
You talk of the hot money, which is parked in short-term certificates in Nigeria. Explain to us a little, the implications of that.
So firstly, it's in the range of $16 to $18 billion, which is currently parked in what are called OMOs, OMO, which are short-term certificates where investors are getting double-digit returns in dollars. But the premise of that return is that the currency remains stable. With the oil price falling more than 20% since the beginning of the year, the entire premise of that double-digit return has been kneecapped. Therefore, I think most of those investors will be looking to hit the eject button as soon as they can. You will basically have a situation at the central bank where they've got to find $16 billion in the next 12 months as these investors seek to cash out. Therefore, it's an entirely precarious situation. It reminds me of that Dutch boy and his finger in the dike. And the way I look at it is that Nigeria is going to have a forced devaluation forced upon it by the markets, by this very unstable situation. It reminds me of 1994 Mexico, where similarly investors were parked in those days, they were called peso bonos, which were paying investors very high returns in dollars. But again, the premise was that the Mexican currency would remain stable. Overnight, when it was obvious to people that the Mexican central bank could not possibly fulfill all the payments at once, and the currency collapsed. So it seems to me we're faced in Nigeria with a redux of that Mexico Tesabona crisis of 1994, and that is what is concerning me. And I think Moody's downgraded Nigeria at the end of last year on that basis, that peg would come under pressure because of the amount of money sitting in short-term deposits, short-term certificates in Nigeria.
Now, in 1994, I was still playing the guitar in bands, but I as far as I know, President Clinton at the time did step in and help some of the hemorrhaging. Do you think Nigeria will be lucky enough to have someone else doing that job?
So think of Mexico. Mexico was sitting on the border of the United States of America. There was a geopolitical interest in keeping a neighbor stable. There is no geopolitical raison d'etre for anyone I can think of to cut a check for this kind of quantum in order to save the Nigerian naira. So my conclusion here is I'm afraid the naira is gone. It's just a question of when.
What, for you,